Welcome to In America, But Not of It, a new podcast series where we'll be exploring the fascinating world of immigration history and the complex ways immigrants have shaped American identity. I am your host, Amanda Roberts, a graduate student in history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I have a public history concentration, which is how we're bringing you this podcast episode today. I am thrilled to be joined by my friend Josh, who will be asking the questions many of you might have as we navigate this journey together. Josh, thank you so much for being here and going on this adventure with me.
Hey, happy to be here, Amanda. I'm excited to learn more about this research that you've been so passionate about.
Thanks so much, Josh. Yeah, it's been quite the journey. I've been working on this for quite some time now, so I definitely have a passion for this subject. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to you more about it and kind of fill you in on what I've been working on. So today's episode is the first in a series where I'll be unpacking my master's thesis research on Scandinavian immigrants in America between 1880 and 1920. This project has been quite the journey, as I said. It's been evolving significantly as I've discovered new sources and perspectives.
Okay, so what can listeners expect from this series?
Oh, yeah. So we have a great episode today, but we also have some amazing episodes coming up. In these episodes, we're going to dive deep into Viking influence and the myths surrounding Norse exploration in America. We'll look at things like the Icelandic sagas, the Kensington runestone, the Maine penny, the Newport Tower, the skeleton and armor poem. It's going to be a lot of fun looking more into that. We'll also explore the remarkable archaeological discoveries at Lonzo Meadows and how they transformed our understanding of pre-Columbian contact. We're also going to dedicate an episode to the rich array of primary sources that bring this history to life. This would include immigrant letters, some Scandinavian language newspapers, institutional records, and so much more. These sources reveal personal stories that add depth and humanity to the broader historical narrative. We'll look at secondary sources too and how they play their role as well. So it's just going to be a fun-filled time. We're going to talk about a lot of fun things, all surrounding, Viking influence, Scandinavian Americans in America, and how they navigated the waters of living in a new world.
It sounds like we're going to be covering a lot of ground. So what's the big picture that ties all of this together?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So essentially throughout this series, we'll be examining a fundamental paradox. Why did Scandinavian immigrants, who were considered ideal newcomers by American society, work so hard to maintain their distinct cultural identity? It challenges our typical understanding of immigrant adaptation and reveals sophisticated strategies for navigating between cultural preservation and American belonging. So today we're going to start by exploring the theoretical frameworks that help us understand this paradox and set the stage for more specific historical examples that we'll discuss in future episodes. But don't worry, we are going to touch on a few things here and there, like the Lonzo Meadows discovery and the Kensington runestone. So we will talk a little bit about that, but essentially what we're going to be doing here is setting up with the theoretical framework.
Okay, so before we dive into the specifics of Scandinavian immigration, could you explain some of the big theories or frameworks you're using to analyze their experience? More of like in terms of cultural pluralism and assimilation. What do those actually mean?
Yeah, absolutely. We should definitely talk about that before we dive in. So there are three main theoretical frameworks that I've focused the most on in my thesis, and that they really do help us understand what was happening with Scandinavian American immigrants. So first, we have the assimilation model, which is a very dominant way of thinking about immigration in America and for much of American history. This theory assumes that immigrants should gradually abandon their cultural distinctiveness and fully adopt American ways. Milton Gordon studied this in the 1960s, and he called it the most prevalent form of Anglo-conformity. The expectation is that immigrants would conform to English cultural patterns and institutions. In contrast to the assimilation model, we have cultural pluralism, which offers a completely different vision. Horace Kalin formally introduced this concept in 1915. He described America as a federation of nationalities, or an orchestra, where each ethnic group contributes its distinct cultural melody while participating in the larger American symphony. Instead of expecting immigrants to abandon their heritage, this framework sees cultural diversity as a strength and suggests immigrants can maintain their cultural traditions while still participating in American civic life. The next theoretical framework is identity process theory. This helps us understand the psychological aspects of immigration. Developed more recently, this theory suggests that our identities are guided by several key principles: continuity across time, feeling distinct from others, self-efficacy, self-esteem, belonging, meaning, and psychological coherence. When these principles are threatened during major life changes, such as immigration, people develop coping strategies to protect their sense of self.
Okay, so these are like different models for how immigrants might adapt to America. And I'm guessing the Scandinavian experience didn't fit neatly into just one of these.
You got it. What makes the Scandinavian case so fascinating is that they practiced a form of cultural pluralism before it was even formally theorized. Despite being positioned as ideal immigrants who could have easily assimilated, they instead developed a sophisticated approach that allowed them to maintain cultural distinctiveness while fully participating in American society. Throughout this discussion, you'll see how Scandinavians created institutions that maintain continuity with their heritage, deployed historical narratives that enhanced their distinctiveness and self-esteem, and navigated the complex terrain between preservation and adaptation in ways that challenge traditional assimilation narratives.
So instead of choosing between becoming fully American or staying completely Scandinavian, they found a middle path that let them be both. They became examples of cultural pluralism at work.
You got it again, and that's the central paradox that I'm exploring. Why the immigrants who faced the least resistance to assimilation invested so heavily in maintaining their cultural distinctiveness, and how they managed to resolve the identity conflict between preservation and integration in such a sophisticated way.
So I want to start really by asking what exactly made you interested in studying Scandinavian immigrants? What's the big mystery you're trying to research here?
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. So what ended up happening was that I actually stumbled across this topic almost by accident. I was researching Viking influence in America, something that, we will talk about, and it is a part of my thesis. But so during this conversation that I had with the chair of my committee, the idea for my thesis turned on like the best way I can describe it. It's like a cartoon light bulb. Here were these Scandinavian immigrants who, on paper, had everything going for them. They were white Protestants who supposedly embodied American values like hard work and self-reliance. These things were going for them because that was what, the dominant society decided was the better qualities for an immigrant. They basically rolled out the welcome mat for them. Then I started to discover these records of Swedish newspapers, Norwegian colleges, Danish cultural centers, and Lutheran churches conducting services in Scandinavian languages. They were creating these elaborate institutions to maintain their cultural distinctiveness, not just for the first generation, but for their children and grandchildren too. And with what I have come to understand about immigration and the dominant model of assimilation, I kept wondering if these immigrants were already accepted, why invest so much energy into preserving what made them different? Wouldn't they want to just blend in and become American as quickly as possible? So I asked myself that question, and with that, the disconnect between what theory would predict and what actually happened is what drew me into this research. It's a puzzle that reshapes how we think about immigrant identity and adaptation.
So I thought immigrants generally wanted to blend in and become American. Why would Scandinavians who were actually welcome try to stay different?
Yeah, so that is what made this so interesting to me. The traditional narrative suggests that immigrants either had to choose between maintaining their heritage or becoming American, but Scandinavians showed it wasn't an either-or proposition. My research revealed they were actively developing a dual identity. They participated fully in American economic and civic life. They voted, served in the military, and built businesses, while they simultaneously created cultural spaces where they could maintain connections to their heritage through language, traditions, and community ties. The surprising insight is that their privileged position as acceptable immigrants actually gave them more freedom to preserve their cultural identity without facing the backlash that other groups experienced. They didn't have to completely abandon their heritage to prove Americanness.
And what do you mean by model immigrants? Who decided they were ideal?
So when I say model immigrants, I'm referencing what was reflected in the racial and cultural hierarchies of the late 19th century in America. Dominant Anglo-Protestant society had very specific ideas about which newcomers would fit in and contribute positively to American society. Scandinavians, they checked all the boxes. They were white Europeans, predominantly Protestant, seen as hardworking and law-abiding, and perceived as coming from countries with democratic traditions. Publications at the time praised their work ethic, fiscal responsibility, and commitment to education. Nativist groups and politicians who were openly hostile to Southern Europeans like Italians, to Jewish and other immigrants from other areas such as Ireland, often pointed to Scandinavians as examples of desirable newcomers. Prominent writers like Halmar Boysen highlighted how Scandinavians' democratic background in their home countries made them particularly suited for American civic life. So this model immigrant status was very much assigned by the dominant culture based on racial, religious, and cultural biases of the era.
So if I understand correctly, not all immigrants were treated equally. What made Scandinavians more acceptable than other groups arriving at the same time?
Right. So elaborating on what we just discussed a little bit, immigration in this period was heavily influenced by racial theories and religious prejudices. Scandinavians benefited tremendously from what scholars refer to as racial privilege. They were seen as Nordic or Teutonic stock, which theories at the time considered to be the highest tier of European peoples. There was also religious compatibility, which was equally important, as Protestant Scandinavians didn't face the intense anti-Catholic sentiment directed at Irish and Italian immigrants. My research found that Scandinavian Lutherans, particularly through the influential Augustana Synod, actually formed early alliances with the American Home Missionary Society, which was a Protestant organization focused on civilizing the American West. Cultural factors played a role too. Scandinavians were praised for their literacy rates, democratic traditions, and supposed compatibility with American values. In 1892, there was a writer who noted their background with democratic institutions made their transition to American civic life relatively seamless.
Were there actual policies favoring Scandinavians, or was this more about social attitudes?
Yeah, it was definitely both. While immigration policies weren't explicitly designed to favor Scandinavians, broader land policies like the Homestead Act of 1862 aligned perfectly with their backgrounds. This legislation was actively promoted in Scandinavia with targeted recruitment campaigns designed specifically for farmers and those who potentially wanted to come to America and have land to farm on. The social attitudes were perhaps even more significant. My research shows that Scandinavians were consistently portrayed positively in American media and literature. They were described as fair and bright, and the fairest of them all in popular poetry and novels. This positive portrayal meant that Scandinavians faced far less discrimination than other immigrant groups. There is also evidence that Scandinavians themselves recognized this advantage and sometimes strategically distanced themselves from less favored groups. They tended to align politically with native-born Americans, and as Boysen, I mentioned him earlier, he noted in 1892, maintained a deep-seated antipathy towards the Irish. This suggests they understood and sometimes leveraged their privileged position.
What kind of organizations did they create? Were they just social clubs, or did they have deeper purposes?
They were far more than just social clubs. They formed comprehensive networks designed to support all aspects of Scandinavian American life. There were religious organizations that were particularly significant. This includes the Augustana Synod, founded in 1860. It grew to become the dominant Swedish American Lutheran denomination with over 1,000 congregations by 1900. Education was another top priority. They established colleges like Dana, Gustavus Adolphus, St. Olaf, and Uppsala, institutions whose very names reflected their desire to preserve cultural values. A robust Scandinavian language press flourished with hundreds of newspapers, including influential publications like Heimdalt, edited by Johan Inander, who promoted the concept of Swedish Americanism. Fraternal organizations like the Independent Order of Vikings, the Sons of Norway, and the Vasa Order provided both cultural connection and practical support. They offered financial assistance, organizing cultural celebrations, and they conducted charitable work as well. Several historical societies, including the Norwegian American Historical Association and the Swedish Pioneer Historical Society, methodically documented their community's experiences. Together, these institutions created a complete cultural ecosystem where Scandinavian Americans could maintain connections to their heritage while navigating their new American life.
How did these institutions help immigrants navigate between their heritage and becoming Americans?
Remember, we did talk briefly about identity process theory earlier. So these institutions provided what identity process theory would call coping strategies for managing the psychological challenges of migration. The Augustana Synod, for example, initially encouraged Americanization, even publishing bilingual materials. Newspapers played a similar role, connecting readers to homeland events while interpreting American society through a familiar cultural framework. These institutions helped immigrants satisfy what psychologists identify as core identity needs to maintaining continuity with their past, feeling a sense of belonging, and developing a coherent sense of self that could incorporate both their Scandinavian heritage and their new American context. So rather than forcing immigrants to choose between preservation and assimilation, these institutions facilitated a more nuanced navigation between cultures. I do briefly want to talk about Vikings and their place in my thesis and how that kind of ties in. There is the theory that was very popular, especially with Scandinavian Americans, that Norse explorers arrived in North America long before Columbus.
So they were basically saying, we were here first. How did other Americans react to these Viking claims?
So the Viking narrative was a powerful tool for asserting a distinctive place in American history. Scandinavian Americans promoted the idea that Leif Erikson, not Columbus, was the true European discoverer of America. This wasn't just about historical accuracy. It was a sophisticated strategy for positioning themselves as both uniquely Scandinavian and fundamentally American. The reception varied significantly. Some elite New Englanders, particularly those with anti-Catholic and anti-Italian sentiments, embraced these narratives. The 1887 Leif Erikson Monument in Boston, championed by wealthy figures like Eben Horsford, emerged during cultural battles between Protestant and Catholic immigrants. These elites used Leif Erikson to counter Irish and Italian Catholic influence in Boston. The 1893 Chicago's World Fair provided a dramatic stage for this narrative battle as well. While a replica of Columbus's Santa Maria floated in the fair's waterways, an authentic Viking ship had sailed across the Atlantic to reach Chicago. This physical demonstration of Viking seafaring capabilities drew large crowds and reinforced Scandinavian claims to primacy in American discovery.
Was the Kensington runestone real? And why did it matter so much to Scandinavian Americans?
I'm glad you brought up the Kensington runestone. It is quite controversial. It was allegedly discovered in Minnesota in 1898, and it has been conclusively shown to be a hoax by most scholars. It contains linguistic anachronisms, including words that just weren't part of any Scandinavian language in the 1300s. There's a word for discovery, for example. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I'm just going to butcher it. So we'll just, it's Opdelhagesfjord. I tried. But anyway, so Rasmus B. Anderson, a prominent Norwegian American scholar who called this a rather clumsy fraud in 1920, he recounted a meeting with the brother-in-law of Olaf Oman. Olaf Oman is the man who allegedly found the stone. But the brother-in-law gave Rasmus B. Anderson several significant winks when pressed about its origins. But its authenticity almost doesn't matter when we consider its cultural significance. The stone claimed that Norse explorers had reached Minnesota in 1362, placing Scandinavians in the American heartland long before other Europeans. For Scandinavian Americans, especially those in the Midwest, This narrative provided a powerful origin story that positioned them not as newcomers, but as returning to lands their ancestors had discovered. This allowed them to claim both a distinctive Scandinavian identity and a foundational role in American history, resolving the tension between cultural preservation and American belonging.
So we talked about Lawns of Meadows in one of our previous episodes. Can you remind me what that site is, and how did its discovery affect these Viking narratives?
Lawns of Meadows completely transformed the Viking narrative by providing the first concrete, scientifically verified evidence of Norse presence in North America. Discovered in 1960 in Newfoundland, Canada, this archaeological site represents the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, dating to approximately 1,000 years ago. What makes this site so significant is that it moved Viking exploration of America from the realm of mythology into established historical fact. The site contains the remnants of 8 buildings, including 3 large halls constructed in the Norse style with turf walls and timber frames. Archaeologists found artifacts, including a bronze pen used for fastening cloaks, a stone oil lamp, and a spindle whorl for spinning wool, all distinctly Norse in origin. Perhaps, though, the most compelling was the discovery of a butternut, which could have only come from regions at least 1,000 kilometers south. This adds some more intrigue by acknowledging that the Viking explorers could have traveled much farther than just Newfoundland, venturing at least as far as New Brunswick and possibly beyond. Or this could be a result of trade with Native Americans. We cannot say definitively one way or the other, but if one believes the sagas, the idea of Vikings venturing deeper along the eastern coast is certainly an interesting concept. For Scandinavian Americans, this discovery was vindicating. After decades of being dismissed for their Viking claims, here was scientific proof that Norse explorers had indeed reached North America around 1000 CE, nearly 500 years before Columbus. Archaeologist Birgitta Wallace has argued that if Leif Erikson was a historical figure as described in the sagas, he likely stayed at this very site. However, the evidence suggests that Lawns of Meadows was not a permanent colony, but rather an exploration base, camp, or gateway. The Norse appear to have occupied it only for a few years, with the site accommodating perhaps 70 to 90 people. It was likely a staging ground for further exploration and resource gathering, rather than a settlement intended for permanent colonization. This discovery provides an interesting bookend to our discussion of the Kensington runestone. While that artifact represents how historical narratives could be manufactured to serve cultural needs, Lawns of Meadows shows that beneath those cultural constructions lay genuine historical achievements that deserve recognition. It reminds us that the line between myth and history isn't always clear-cut in how immigrant groups understand and represent their heritage.
This identity process theory that you mentioned earlier sounds interesting, but can you break it down for me? How does it explain what Scandinavian immigrants were doing?
So, identity process theory helps us understand how people maintain a stable sense of who they are during major life changes. Immigration is certainly one of the most disruptive life changes that someone can go through. According to the theory, our identities are guided by several key principles. You've got continuity across time, feeling distinct from others, self-efficacy or feeling in control, self-esteem, belonging, meaning, and psychological coherence. When these principles are threatened, as they certainly would be when moving to a new country, people develop coping strategies to protect their sense of self. What's fascinating about Scandinavian immigrants is how in-depth their coping strategies were. By establishing churches, newspapers, and cultural organizations, they maintained continuity with their past. By promoting Viking discovery narratives, they enhanced their self-esteem and created meaning. By developing what historians call cultural pluralism, they achieved psychological coherence between their heritage and their new American context. Their relatively privileged position as model immigrants gave them more freedom to deploy these strategies without triggering the hostility that other immigrants faced when trying to maintain cultural distinctiveness.
So you're saying that maintaining their cultural identity actually helped them succeed in America rather than holding them back?
Yeah, so from what I'm seeing in my research, that is exactly the conclusion I would come to. This challenges the traditional assumption that immigrants must abandon their heritage to succeed in America. For Scandinavians, cultural preservation and American success weren't opposing forces. They were complementary strategies. Their cultural institutions provided social networks, educational opportunities, and support systems that actually facilitated economic and civic integration. Maintaining connections to their heritage gave them psychological stability during the challenging transition to American life. Perhaps most importantly, their dual identity as both Scandinavian and American allowed them to navigate different contexts effectively. They could participate fully in American civic and economic life while still having communities where they could speak their native languages and practice familiar traditions. The Scandinavian experience suggests that when immigrants have sufficient security and agency, maintaining cultural distinctiveness can enhance rather than impede their participation in broader society. This insight has significant implications for how we think about immigration and integration today.
So I know we had mentioned it before, maybe just briefly, but what exactly is cultural pluralism? Is that the same as what we call multiculturalism today?
So my thesis is centered around cultural pluralism, and this was formally introduced by Horace Kalin in 1915. My research shows that Scandinavian Americans were already good examples of cultural pluralism decades earlier than when Kalin introduced this idea. He envisioned America as a federation of nationalities or an orchestra where each ethnic group contributes its distinct cultural melody while participating in a shared civic symphony. While related to what we now call multiculturalism, there are very important differences. Cultural pluralism emphasized both preservation of ethnic heritage and shared civic participation, a balance between distinctiveness and unity. It challenged the dominant melting pot metaphor that expected immigrants to completely abandon their cultural uniqueness. Modern multiculturalism emerged in the 1960s and 1970s initially as multi-ethnic education and tends to focus more explicitly on power relations and addressing inequalities than Kalin's original formulation. Some scholars like John Hyam have argued that multiculturalism sometimes lacks what he called a nourishing center of shared civic culture that was central to Kalin's vision.
Do you think Scandinavian Americans actually influenced how Americans think about immigration and assimilation?
Yeah, I believe they did, though perhaps not always in ways we immediately recognize. By successfully modeling a form of cultural pluralism before it was theorized, they demonstrated that immigrants could maintain meaningful connections to their heritage while participating in American society. Their experience challenged the binary thinking that immigrants must either completely assimilate or remain isolated in ethnic enclaves. Instead, they showed how immigrant groups could develop sophisticated dual identities that incorporated both their heritage and their American context. This approach, maintaining cultural continuity while engaging in civic life, later became central to Kalin's formal theory of cultural pluralism and continues to influence debates about immigration and national identity today. However, we should also acknowledge that Scandinavians' ability to navigate this balance was deeply influenced by their racial and religious privilege. Their experience shows how America's racial hierarchies shaped which groups had the freedom to practice cultural pluralism without facing harsh backlash.
How does what you learn about Scandinavian immigrants relate to what's happening with immigration today?
So the Scandinavian experience offers several insights relevant to contemporary immigration debates. First, it challenges simplistic either-or thinking about cultural preservation and integration. Modern immigrants, like Scandinavians before them, aren't faced with binary choice between maintaining their heritage or becoming American. They can develop nuanced identities that incorporate both. Second, it highlights how reception context profoundly shapes immigrant adaptation. Scandinavians benefited from racial and religious privilege that afforded them greater agency in managing their cultural adaptation. Today's debates about which immigrants are desirable or undesirable echoes similar hierarchies, though the specific categories have shifted. Third, the robust institutions Scandinavians built, from churches to newspapers to cultural organizations, remind us how important community infrastructure is for supporting healthy immigrant adaptation. These weren't barriers to integration, but rather bridges that facilitated it. And finally, the Scandinavian assertion of historical significance through Viking narratives parallels how contemporary immigrant groups seek to have their contributions to American society recognized and valued, whether through education, public commemoration, or cultural celebration.
Do you think modern immigrant groups face similar challenges with identity, or is the situation totally different now?
While the specific context has certainly changed, many of the fundamental psychological and social dynamics remain similar. Immigrants still face the challenge of maintaining psychological continuity with their heritage while adapting to a new cultural environment. They still need to develop identities that can coherently incorporate both their origins and their current identity. However, several factors have transformed the experience. Technology has revolutionized how immigrants maintain connections with their homelands. What once required physical institutions like newspapers and community centers can now occur through social media and digital communication. Transnational ties are easier to maintain, creating new possibilities for identity formation that weren't available to Scandinavians or other immigrants at the time. The reception context also differs significantly. Today's immigration debates occur in a post-civil rights era with different understandings of race, ethnicity, and national belonging. The formal legal discrimination that shaped earlier immigration experiences has largely been dismantled, though certainly informal biases still persist. What remains consistent is the fundamental human need to construct coherent identities during major life transitions and the social negotiations that occur as immigrant groups find their place within American society. Modern immigrants, like Scandinavians before them, actively shape their adaptation rather than passively assimilating or remaining isolated.
As we reach the conclusion of our episode, I just have a couple more questions for you. What sources did you find most valuable in your research? And were there any personal stories that really stood out to you?
My research benefited tremendously from a diversity of primary and secondary sources that revealed different facets of the Scandinavian American experience. For primary sources, immigrant letters provided intimate glimpses into personal experiences. Arnold Barton's collection, Letters from the Promised Land, Swedes in America, 1840 to 1914, was particularly valuable and interesting. It contained correspondence that showed how immigrants portrayed their new lives to family back home. These letters typically emphasize opportunities by downplaying hardships, influencing others' decisions to immigrate. They reveal the complex emotional and practical considerations behind migration decisions. Newspapers were another crucial primary source. The sheer volume was remarkable. By 1909, Scandinavian publications had a circulation of over 1.1 million. These publications served not just as information sources, but as forums for developing concepts like Swedish Americanism. These papers negotiated between homeland connections and American integration for their readers. For scholarly analysis, Dag Blanc's The Creation of an Ethnic Identity, Being Swedish American in the Augustana Synod, 1860 to 1917, was groundbreaking in showing how identity was consciously constructed through institutions. Jorn Brondel's analysis of how Scandinavians were positioned in racial hierarchies as the fairest among the so-called white races revealed how deeply racial thinking permeated immigration discourse. The Viking narratives provided fascinating material, especially the controversies surrounding artifacts. The contrasting analyses of the Kensington runestone, Carl Skog's 1928 defense of its authenticity versus Rasmus Anderson's 1920 declaration that it was a rather clumsy fraud, showed how historical truth often took a backseat to cultural meaning. Finding Anderson's account of how Andrew Anderson gave him several significant winks when pressed about the stone's origins was one of those delightful moments in archival research that brings historical figures to life. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair materials were also really interesting to look into. Contemporary accounts of how the authentic Viking ship drew larger crowds than Columbus's replicas vividly illustrated competing historical narratives at play. There are also photographs from the fair showing both vessels side by side, capturing this cultural competition in visual form. Some of these images, including those, are included in my actual written thesis, as well as images of the Kensington runestone, the Newport Tower, and other Viking artifacts. What struck me the most across these diverse sources was how intentional and strategic Scandinavian immigrants were in constructing their American identity. This wasn't a passive process of either assimilation or isolation, but rather a sophisticated navigation of complex cultural terrain. Their experience challenges simplistic narratives about immigration adaptation and reveals the agency that immigrants experience in shaping their own identities within constraints of their historical context.
Your thesis talks about cultural pluralism versus assimilation theories. Do you think one approach is better than the other for immigrants and for America as a society?
rather than suggesting one approach is universally better, my research points to the value of recognizing multiple valid paths of adaptation. The Scandinavian experience demonstrates that the binary choice often presented between complete assimilation and cultural isolation is a false dichotomy. What seems most beneficial is what scholars now call selective acculturation, where immigrants integrate into key aspects of American economic and civic life while maintaining valuable cultural connections and community ties. In other words, cultural pluralism. This approach supports psychological well-being by satisfying core identity needs for both continuity and belonging. For American society more broadly, the pluralistic model often offers significant advantages. It recognizes that cultural diversity represents a resource rather than a problem to be solved. Different cultural traditions bring valuable perspectives, skills, and insights that can enrich American life and help address complex challenges. However, it is important to acknowledge that the reception context significantly shapes which approaches are available to different immigrant groups. Scandinavians had the privilege of choice in how they navigated their cultural adaptation due to their positioning within America's racial and religious hierarchies. Not all groups have had the same freedom, and not all groups have the same freedom today. A truly equitable approach would ensure that all immigrant groups have the agency to determine how they balance cultural preservation and adaptation based on their specific needs and values, rather than just having a single model imposed upon them. The key insight from the Scandinavian experience isn't that their specific balance was ideal, but rather that immigrants should have the freedom to navigate this complex terrain on their own terms.
So what was the most surprising thing that you discovered during your research?
I think what surprised me the most was discovering that the very immigrants who appeared most successful at becoming American, those who faced the least resistance to integration, invested so heavily in preserving their cultural distinctiveness. This challenges the assumption that cultural preservation results primarily from marginalization or exclusion. I was also struck by how sophisticated their identity management strategies were. These weren't immigrants simply clinging to old world traditions out of nostalgia. They were strategically developing dual identities that positioned them as both distinctly Scandinavian and fundamentally American. Their Viking narratives, for example, didn't just assert cultural pride. They rewrote the American origin story to give themselves a founding role in the nation's history. Finally, I was surprised by how much agency Scandinavian immigrants exercised in defining their place in American society. Rather than passively accepting assimilation or isolation, they actively crafted identities that served both their psychological needs for continuity and their practical needs for social acceptance. This more complex understanding of immigrant adaptation has significantly changed how I view historical and contemporary immigration experiences.
So if you could have modern Americans take away one lesson from your research, what would it be?
If there's one lesson I hope people take away, it's that cultural preservation and American belonging are not opposing forces. The Scandinavian experience shows that maintaining meaningful connections to cultural heritage can actually enhance rather than impede civic engagement and social integration. This insight challenges both extremes in our immigration debates. It contradicts assimilationist perspectives that expect immigrants to completely abandon their cultures to become truly American. But it also challenges perspectives that see cultural distinctiveness as inherently separatist or anti-American. The most successful approach, as Scandinavians demonstrated, is, in my opinion, developing what Kalin later called cultural pluralism, maintaining valuable aspects of cultural heritage while fully participating in shared civic life. This balance creates psychological coherence for immigrants while enriching American society with diverse perspectives and traditions. Understanding this history helps us move beyond simplified debates about whether immigrants are assimilating enough to more nuanced discussions about how we can create a society where diverse cultural identities and shared civic engagement reinforce rather than undermine each other. So we're wrapping up the first episode in our new podcast series, In America, But Not of It. And I just want to take a moment to thank you all for listening. And thank you, Josh, for coming on and participating and having a good time with me. I'm looking forward to publishing our other episodes. And yeah, thank you so much for coming out.
No, yeah, I had a great time. I feel like I learned a lot. I hope I asked questions that helped our listeners understand as well. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much again, and we'll see you on the next episode. This is Amanda.
This is Josh.
Thanks, guys.